activities. And the first one here is production and cultivation. So the planting, growing, cultivating, harvesting of marijuana could really be done in both the cities and the townships. Typically, this will occur in some of our industrial buildings, sheds, greenhouses. The current HR bill has a production size limit. You can see that on the screen, some of the canopy size limits. This will likely prohibit some of the larger pot farms that maybe you've heard about or read about out in some of the western states. Given the canopy size limits, we're not anticipating we would see that level of production. One interesting thing that I learned researching out in the state of Oregon was the right to farm ordinances and how those ordinances intersect with any local zoning controls if marijuana will be defined as a crop when this legislation moves forward. So when we think, next slide, when we think about production and cultivation, here are some of the questions that will need to be answered. Can you go to the next slide? So here are the big kind of the zoning questions that each community will need to look at. Are we going to treat this as a commercial use or an agricultural use? Are we going to establish some minimum parcel sizes to cultivate? Some states had very specific rules on the size of property that you can produce marijuana. And then are we going to create some buffers and separation rules? Odor has been a pretty common issue out in some of the states. And so we would need to determine how we're going to mitigate any odor issues. Fencing and security, lighting, these are all issues that we would need to look at during the site review process. Next slide. So then the second main category that we might see here is the manufacturing and wholesale and distribution of marijuana. And again, it will have the same set of questions. What zoning districts, is this appropriate? Do we have minimum lot sizes? Is this permitted by right? Are we going to go through a public hearing process? Again, how are we going to mitigate any light pollution or odor control? Once you get into this type of land use, I've heard a lot about the need for a lot more security surveillance of these sites. Next slide. You can go to the next slide. So the third main activity that we may see here in Scott County is the retail outlets. And here the current legislation has already established some buffer or separation rules for any retail outlets. Cannot be within 1,000 feet of any school, daycare, nursing home, house of worship. Some other states we've looked at have expanded that separation to other types of uses, libraries, arcades, transit centers. It's very similar to how a lot of us treat adult bookstores and adult video stores, having that type of separation. Another thing that some states tried to deal with, or local communities, is really the concentration of marijuana retail outlets. Some states are able to set a limit on the number of licenses. We don't see that in the current legislation. Therefore, we may have to establish some separations within our zoning to avoid having real concentrated areas. And what we don't know here in Scott County, given our entertainment destinations, if we will likely see a lot of outlets, either existing stores that will be licensed to sell marijuana or brand new retail outlets popping up down here in the county. So the legislation does suggest that there'll be some model ordinances for all the communities to consider, and gives the cities and townships and county time to adopt those ordinances. And that would likely be the next step then, is to take a look at those models, determine what makes sense in each of our communities, and then update our zoning codes. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Go to the next slide, Trace. Good morning. My name is Cindy Geis. I'm the Community Services Director. I'm going to talk a little bit about the different business types. I'm going to be talking about these broadly. I don't need to read them to you, but as you can see, there are a laundry list, 12, 13 different types of businesses that are going to need state issued license. please think about that. These are state issued licenses, not local issued licenses. So, and many of them can be done in coordination with others. As you can see on some of them, the wholesaler can also hold the hemp transporter, delivery, and event organizer license. So I would imagine that most of these industries are going to come through and want to set up a business. They're going to probably want to set up multiple businesses in one location. Next slide, Trace. I wanted to talk a little bit about the taxation of cannabis. There has been some conversations, particularly in other states, on what type of taxes, how high are they, how low are they? And in this, in the proposed bill, as what was alluded to, our excise tax is going to be pretty low in comparison to some of the other taxes. And the reason that is there is a fairly strong assumption, at least from the party that was presenting the bill, that this, by reducing and keeping low this excise tax, that it will probably or hopefully help reduce or eliminate these illicit sales that seem to go on because of the extreme taxes in some other states. I don't read it, and we're going to go right into the economic development. You bet. Thanks, Trace. There are 4 programs that are actually set up to entice economic development within the proposed legislation that we currently have. So think about these as industries, if this legislation goes forward or goes forward in some fashion, how the industry is going to get funded, how education is going to be done, lots of different things. But we'll start with the first one, which is your CanGrow. If you think about the title, CanGrow is who's going to grow it. It is really looking at who are the farmers, we'll put that in quote, or who is the industry that's actually growing product. And you can see that it's going to be eligible for certain industries that are then going to have to provide the grants to the farmers to expand the growth in the state of Minnesota. You can move on. The CAN startup is exactly what it is. Again, there's grants and loans. So some of them have some strings attached to them, such as you have to stay in business for a certain period of time. But really what this is for nonprofits to actually be able to provide or subsidize a business to get going and hopefully be successful. They're really focusing on these social equity areas, the areas that were kind of targeted back really early in some of those years where there was prohibition going on. The Can Navigate grants is for organizations to provide the assistance necessary for companies to understand what is it that I have to do? What does I have to do? How do I get going? What applications do I need? What reporting do I need? Those grants help them understand the business. Go ahead, Tracy. And then the last one is the Can Train. As we all know, there's no, well, most of us, at least licensed businesses don't exist currently in the state. So there is going to need to be, in order for us to make sure that the businesses that are operating in the correct way, there are going to be a lot of training grants that are out there for people who work in the industry, for people who run different parts of the industry. And it's really targeted toward folks that are facing barriers to education, maybe in some of those areas that have some extreme either unemployment and or not livable. And from that, I'll move on and go to the next speaker.
Okay, looks like that's me, myself, and Chief Sawyer are going to double team this. So, Chief, feel free to pipe in whenever you want to. You can see by the slides here that what we're looking at doesn't include any additional dollars for cities, and that could be a problem. We've got something that's going to be made that's currently illegal, going to be made legal. There's probably going to be a need for additional law enforcement officers, possibly additional prosecutors, for sure DREs, drug recognition experts, because right now there really is no good way to test on the roadside for marijuana like there is for alcohol with the PBT and the intoxilizer. There really isn't anything yet out there that's reliable. There's an ordered fluid roadside test, but that has been proven to be unreliable. And also a passive exposure to marijuana could be a positive on that test. So it's really not nothing out there that can really be a good roadside test for marijuana. So that oral fluid roadside test would be easily defeatable by any kind of decent defense attorney. And also even the DREs, although they're very good, it's, in my opinion, a good cross-examination can really make that not be beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's going to be an issue for law enforcement, is getting a good test on this stuff. You saw in the previous slide, there's 12 to 15 million Americans are driving impaired on THC. So think about that this afternoon when you're driving through a foot of snow and people's reaction times out there are possibly being impaired. Also, there's underrepresentation as far as even when you do get a good test on THC, whether you get a good blood test or not. There's called polydrug testing, whether there's more than one drug or not available in the system. 84% of those tests include one drug, 14.5% include more than one drug, 20.5% of those is marijuana and another drug, and over half of that is marijuana and alcohol. And this is underreported because what I just talked about with marijuana. If the officers can get a good test for alcohol, don't even bother with the THC test, because what's the point? You already got the violation on alcohol, so you just let the marijuana go and don't even bother with it because it's such a hassle. Okay, you can go to the next slide. We can see how it's culturally acceptable to drive high, and when you make something from legal like that, you take away any kind of, I don't know, you make it acceptable. It's more acceptable to get high at home. It's more acceptable to get high when you're out with your friends. It's more acceptable to get high in public. So it's just, you take away that, of illegality, and you're just going to do more things with it, including driving your car. And you can see that 27% admit they drive high daily. And again, that's pretty scary. And as you can expect, with marijuana being made illegal in Colorado, the marijuana arrests decreased 68% from 2012 to 2019. So of course, you make something illegal, your arrests will go down. The possession arrests were decreased 71%, sale arrests were decreased 56%, and the production arrests actually increased 3%. And what I found interesting in Colorado was that there was no significant change in minor use from that last study from 2012 to 2019. And also, you heard in the previous presentation about the equity issues of marijuana arrests and drug arrests. Legalization didn't help that at all. Latin and African American arrests were still more than doubled over whites. There was a decrease in arrests, obviously, because what I talked about, you make something legal, there's going to be a decrease in arrests. But whites decreased 72%, blacks 55%, or Hispanics 55%, and blacks 63%. So that the equity argument didn't really hold so far in Colorado. And this just talks about traffic deaths. You can see where legalization was made in 2013, how it spiked up and kept on going up to 2017, slight decrease in the following year, but then started spiking up again. So again, you just have more people that find it more acceptable to smoke marijuana. They think they can drive, and it causes problems, and unfortunately deaths. Again, this is just another graph testing positive for marijuana. And again, legalization in 2013, again, it kind of mirrors the previous graph where he spiked in 2017, slight decrease after that, but then started spiking again. Chief, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, thank you. The threat to public safety posed by marijuana impaired driving on US roadways is quickly becoming a major concern, partially due to the legalization of marijuana and medical marijuana in many states. Marijuana use especially frequently, whether daily or nearly daily, and in high doses can cause disorientation and sometimes unpleasant thoughts or feelings of anxiety or paranoia. And from a mental health perspective, I've been on the mental health commission for quite a number of years and on the governor's task force, and found out that the current continuum of care is like throwing a bowl of spaghetti on the wall. If we can't figure out the continuum of care, how can clients? And people who use marijuana more frequently likely to develop temporary psychosis, which is not knowing what is real, hallucinations, or paranoia, and long-lasting mental disorders, including schizophrenia. The association between marijuana and schizophrenia is stronger in people who start using marijuana at an early age and use marijuana more frequently. Marijuana use has also been linked to depression, social anxiety, and thoughts of suicide, suicide attempts, and suicide. You look in Scott County, and our increase in mental health calls for service is skyrocketing, and a lot has to do with drug use also. The law enforcement in 18 states that have legalized marijuana are struggling with much needed resources as the increase in calls for service involving drug use have climbed dramatically. Whether it's a mental health issue or driving under the influence of drugs, additional training and equipment is necessary to respond appropriately to the calls for service, let alone trying to, like I said earlier, trying to figure out the continuum of care for those suffering a mental health crisis. We've been struggling with that since the early 70s. We know that marijuana impairs a person's ability to operate a vehicle safely. We know that states consider legalizing marijuana. The threat to traffic safety must be a major consideration and cannot be overlooked. You saw the statistics in the earlier slides. The incidence of drug driving are on the increase nationwide, especially with increased use of marijuana as more states move to legalize medical marijuana and recreational marijuana sales. And also the frequency of drivers and fatal crashes. I know we're talking about not only in Colorado, but Washington State, who tested positive for THC alone or in combination with alcohol or other drugs have skyrocketed over 111% from the previous 4-year average. In 2013, what Ron was commenting on earlier, in 2013, the legalization year in Colorado shows that 11% of all traffic deaths were driver tested positive for marijuana. Talking about this slide here, illegal sales market, some believe that nationwide legalization of marijuana would decrease the black market, as there is a decreased need to traffic marijuana in other states. Others feel that the legalization would not stop the black market due to past examples like how cheap cigarettes are illegally trafficked into cities with high tobacco taxes. Like, for instance, the District of Columbia is $4.98 a 20-pack. New York, Connecticut, $4.35 a 20-pack. And Minnesota is right behind with $3.04 for a 20-pack. So we're seeing a lot more of that also in the state of Minnesota. In 2019, investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Black Market Marijuana Team and local law enforcement seized nearly $6 million worth of illegally grown marijuana across 40 grows cited in one county. This is a concern to us. And why is there an increase? Some say is that a lot of people don't want to go through the process of getting licensed through the state. There's a lot, it costs a lot more. You put all these excise sales taxes for schools, taxes for the government, and then license, and then who's going to monitor this? I hope it's not placed on the law enforcement table that our table is already full. We're responding to mental health calls for service, and we don't have the equipment or the education to respond to those. Now now you would think about putting marijuana on the table. It's a domino effect. We're going to need more officers, more training. We're going to need more Scott County attorney staff. We're going to need more dispatchers, more paramedics. I mean, it's a domino effect. The $24 million cost that was brought up in the legislation to start up this program, I would venture to say that I would love to see a lot of that go to building IRFs facilities. You got to understand, law enforcement is the first line of defense in identifying and reducing drug driving. The adverse effects of many substances, including marijuana, can be difficult to detect on the roadside unless officers are properly trained, as what Ron Holsapar mentioned earlier. Only a small percentage of police working patrol duties have been trained on how to identify impaired drivers. And currently in Scott County, we have 2 drug recognition experts, just 2. And that's a 3-week school. And one of my officers is a DRE, and I will continue to send him to school. He's been he's been called into not only throughout Scott County, but Dakota County and Hennepin County, because they don't have DREs. This has taken up a lot of our time. Education and training will help law enforcement officers reduce roadway deaths and injuries involving drug impaired drivers. This, like I said, that HF 600, they want 25 million for proposed cost of implementation. And also it cannot prohibit the possession, transport, use of cannabis or products, and we, the city or county, cannot prohibit the establishment or operations of a licensed cannabis business. Back in 2019, I was very fortunate to be a part of a chief's roundtable discussion in Denver, Colorado, actually in Aurora, where I sat down with 95 police chiefs from across the state of Colorado. And they saw that they were pushing against the legalization. However, they saw that the political movement was coming and that it was going to be passed. So they wanted to get ahead of it. And they had stated at their roundtable discussion, and I brought up the questions about Minnesota probably going down this avenue. They said, get ahead of it. Make sure that the law enforcement officers have the proper training and equipment, and also that cities and counties can opt out of having a dispensary or a retail establishment within your city and county. That's all I have.
And you can just see from the other slides, I know our time is out, but all the case filings with marijuana as the main felony count have all decreased. And you can see that the Cato Institute overall violent crime has neither soared nor plummeted in the wake of marijuana legalization. I think you will find that some crimes such as armed robbery near these dispensaries has increased because it's a cash business, because no banks will basically deal with them, no federal banks anyway. So that has increased. And again, just more stats out of like the Pew Research Center talking about marijuana possession and arrest. And like I talked about earlier, you will see that being decreased just because you make something that is illegal, then the police don't have to deal with that anymore. You just have to deal with the collateral consequences of that substance being made legal, such as driving and increased robberies and increased thefts, that type of thing. You know, in Minnesota already, the first unless you're a sales case, it's going to be a gross misdemeanor. It's not even a felony anymore, like it was a few years ago. So Minnesota has already made it a non-felony disposition, at least for the first offense. I think of these mollies.
Okay, I guess I'm next to talk about the employer considerations. So as leaders, we all wear the employer hat as leaders of organizations, and that carries obligations that come under the law. And so the employer role, when you think about legalization of marijuana, it's just becoming more complex because the requirements are contradictory in nature. And a perfect example of this is at the federal level, it's illegal, but in multiple states, it is permissible at the state level. And so it leaves an employer saying, what do I do? So primarily for employers, the consideration for this is a workplace safety issue. And so we're going to be looking at, and we're going to need to look at what our current policies state, and also what's being written to change that. So we're going to have to look at our drug-free workplace policies. We're going to have to look at our drug and alcohol programs. And those are things that are going to impact potentially practices around hiring and screening procedures, about impacts to insurance, potentially some of our risk mitigation strategies, and our training requirements. So for instance, we may have to do more reasonable suspicion training related to how do I know if someone's under the influence of cannabis in the workplace. And so we might have to do more of that with our supervisors. And then also, as I indicated, because of federal and state regulations being different, we have to write policy that kind of threads that needle. And what does that look like? So we're going to have to work with legal teams to do that. So far in looking at other states, and in what's happened so far in Minnesota, because it is legal for medical use, nothing allows a person to be under the influence on the job in the workplace or to be using in the workplace. And so those are the things that we're going to have to rally around as employers to bring consistency to some of our practices. Next slide, please. So where it really gets murky is under the rights and responsibilities side, because we have our employer obligations, again, to maintain a safe workplace, and yet this is enabling legislation that allows use for individuals. And so we're going to have to understand specifically based on what's written, and again, that's why it's somewhat what we think is coming, because until it's written, we don't know. So we're really going to have to look at that and try to balance our practices. So medical marijuana is currently authorized under law. So we're hoping that's going to be, the backdrop that we can build off of, but that's not necessarily true. Medical and recreational programs may have to look different and may have to be administered different. And so those are things we're just going to have to be cognizant of. And then it's really where this is going to intersect other laws. So employers have to balance a lot of things as part of our employer hat. And so it's where this is going to intersect, disability discrimination, potentially workers' compensation programs, unemployment, and OSHA. That's where we really have to focus, and that's what determines some of the actions that we take. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So when it comes to testing, as an example, bills tend to limit the testing. And so, for instance, we can only test right now if someone is impaired on the job. But again, what is impairment on the job? What does that really look like? We can test if someone has a work-related accident or a personal injury, or if a policy is violated. But for instance, with cannabis, if you do tests and someone is positive, were they under the influence? You have to prove they were under the influence. And the testing for cannabis isn't quite as, assumptively positive as it is for alcohol. And so those are things that are emerging and evolving, and different court cases we're seeing across other states tend to rule differently. So we're left in this quirky quagmire of what is the compliance line that we're trying to meet. So again, testing is for the procedures are tending to follow alcohol, but it's not the same. And then always with testing programs, we're seeing that there are exceptions. So again, there could be different administrative requirements for us based on position types. And this is just a list of some of the exception testing that we're seeing in other states for different types of classes of workers that counties and cities may implement. So again, it just leads to the complexity issue for an employer. Next slide, please. And then these are just a couple other examples of areas that we are watching in how whatever's written might intersect and or change how we have to look at things because there's other laws on the books. So Minnesota does have protections for employees who are registered in the state as users of medical marijuana. So in the example I gave previously, if someone had an accident at work and tested positive for the use, you may not be able to discipline in the way you might have written in your policy because there are protections now, and that could be discriminatory for someone who is approved to use medical marijuana. So what it does is it puts what used to be zero tolerance policies into question, and you have to look at everything case by case. From a workers' compensation standpoint, again, it's just more being aware that there are multiple things that could be going on there. So for instance, as our medical marijuana program was originally written, an employer would not be obligated, an employer was obligated to pay for marijuana as part of something that might have been prescribed because of a workplace accident. That was just overturned. So again, we're seeing that lots of these types of legislation have what's written by our legislators, and then we have a lot of court cases that keep changing the shape of it over time. And so you really just have to be aware of all of these things going forward. Additionally, in Minnesota, marijuana does not in and of itself invalidate a workers' compensation claim. So again, a lot of people might assume that if I am using and have an accident at work, that I wouldn't qualify for workers' comp, but that's not necessarily the case. You may or you may not. And if an employer wanted to fight something like that, you'd have to prove that they were impaired, and proving impairment is not going to be that easy because, again, maybe I was on vacation a week ago in a state where recreational use was approved, and now a week later I had an accident at work and I test positive, but does that mean I was under the influence? Those are things that are not clear for employers at this time. Next slide, please. And then these are just a couple more areas. Again, the unemployment insurance is going to be a lot like the topic I just hit on, where it's just not clear whether or not some of our current laws and how we understand them are going to apply. Are they going to be approved for unemployment or not? And again, we see in other states where things are reversing on itself. Just when you think you understand what it is, it's just not ruled to be the case. And then really it's under Minnesota OSHA where we're going to have our primary challenges, because again, as an employer, we have a general duty clause where we need to keep the workplace free of hazards. Well, being under the influence of drug and alcohol is a hazard, and yet it's also going to be enabled for individuals. And so it's just going to be, again, that balancing act between what do we need to do as employers to meet our obligations, but yet not violate individuals' rights because things have been allowed. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, really, what are some of the things that we as employers need to be thinking about right now? So it's how do we maintain the safe workplace amid marijuana enabling legislation? How are we going to balance the drug-free workplace obligations with the employee rights stuff? What testing policy and possible ramifications are going to make sense for us, and how do we change our policies for that? How is the recreational and medical marijuana legislation going to coexist on the operations side? Are those going to be largely the same or very different programs? And then how are we going to administer those? What internal teams are we going to need to have assembled to think through and set up the programs in response to this legislation? So right now I'm seeing it as your administration with your HR, with your legal, with your risk managers, and then possibly others. We might need some outside help as well. And then we can't forget, again, in Minnesota, that we have obligations to negotiate impacts of policy that affect the terms and conditions of employment. So we're going to have to be talking with our unions about anything that we're planning to put in place. And then finally, just how do we stay abreast of this legislation? And again, as leaders and as it's fitting, how do we help influence some of the language so that we do get some of the clarity that we need so that it isn't so murky forward? Thank you.
So we'll go quickly through these. This was just kind of a summary of some of the things that you've heard. Next slide, go ahead. The regulation, it's clearly coming from the state, but there's some discussion on delegation and how is that coordinated? Again, what is the local agency's control in this and how do we play into it? How does this change the investigations? You heard Ron talk about it's more difficult. And then the prosecution, this is really going to probably change some of this discussion as well within our legal system. The others are kind of local, our social host, municipalities and their ordinances, our public health nuisance ordinance could all be impacted by this, things to think about. Keep going. And then the lack of research on some of the legalization on probation departments. This came up through our community corrections discussions. What does that mean? What is the impact here? They're all going to be impacted in some way and trying to understand that. And then the effect of legalization, again, would have on probation. There's some data on it. You saw a few slides that Ron had there at the end, but there will be some major impacts in that area as well. Keep going. And then finally, there's a couple other bills potentially that could be impacted, the Clean Indoor Air Act. And would there need to be bills specific to where this could be smoked? What does it mean about these smoke-free government buildings? So there's a whole host of things that have come up in these discussions. There could be other policy things that the state and local governments need to think through. And with that now, I am going to turn this over to our friends from Colorado to share their experience with us. And I think Denise will be up first from Manitou Springs.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. And thanks for asking me. I'm just giving a very quick overview of Manitou Springs and what we have done. And please know that I've been here for 2 years and this has been in place for some time. So in November of 2013, the voters approved to have 2 marijuana stores here at Manitou. And we are a small town of about 5,000 people next to the bigger town of Colorado Springs. So they approved it at that time, and there were some real limitations. There could only be 2, and they were restricted of how close they could be to any school, parks, anything like that. So there were a lot of restrictions that happened. And they have to go through a special licensing program. So they have to be, every year they have to go and ask for a license, they get evaluated, we do site visits, we monitor, and we do those type of things. The one thing that has happened for us is the ballot question also included a range from 5 to 10% taxes, and it gave the city council the authority to increase or decrease that tax. So we just took it for a first reading this last council meeting, and the council is looking at increasing it at 10% and then using those funds for capital improvement. From a law enforcement perspective, I can't give you a lot of numbers on that. However, I will say, all of us, I think today are dealing with COVID and with lots of different items that are causing behavioral health and how we manage it and what that looks like. So I can give you that perspective, but I can't say it's related to marijuana or not at this point. One of the things that we do with some of this funding is we give the local school district some funding to help with mental health and those type of things. So it helps with their programs that they have at the school. Other than that, we also started a URA when we started this, a urban renewal plan and it's in the area where the 2 businesses are located. And so it's really helping renew that area and provide some funding to get some different businesses there and landscape and those type of things. So that's a big picture from the city of Manitou is it has helped for sure with our revenue and for us to get some capital projects done and completed and enhance the quality of life in that way here in Manitou Springs.
Thank you, Denise. I think now up will be Courtney from Colorado Springs.
Hello, and greetings from Olympic City, USA. As you mentioned, my name is Courtney Brown, and I'm the Senior Policy and Strategic Plan Analyst for the City of Colorado Springs. Much like Denise, I'm new to this role, relocated back to Colorado, but had been heavily engaged into the medical marijuana passage in Maryland. Thank you for inviting me to come and share in the conversation this morning. It's a pleasure to dialogue with you about this highly important and heavily debated issue of our time. Marijuana legalization isn't straightforward on the medical or recreational side as many people think. In fact, it's really complicated and complex. I'll be sharing the complexity of the Colorado Springs experience. And after today, myself and our public safety team made up of fire and police can make themselves available for additional presentations or question and answer discussions. I convened a group of people in preparation for talking with you all this morning, and they were anxious to talk more if that's so needed. To set the City of Colorado Springs marijuana legalization context, let me start by saying, emphasizing really, cannabis use in the state of Colorado is a constitutional right made through passage of Amendment 20 in 2000, legalizing medical use, and then the passage of Amendment 64 in 2012, which legalized recreational use. No regulation or enforcement can infringe on that right. So with that being said, the Colorado experience with marijuana legalization has been based around first, medical dispensary regulation and enforcement, and second, what it has meant to not permit retail sales within our city limits. This second point is where Colorado Springs and the city of Manitou differ. And although located in the same county, El Paso County, we have separate governing bodies and municipal boundaries and have opted for different requirements regarding marijuana. This makes for what I believe to be a good comparison of our different experiences. And you've already heard from Denise. As far as the Colorado Springs experience, after I speak, I will include in the chat 2 links. The first is a link to the City of Colorado Springs marijuana in Colorado Springs page to give reference to the timeline of policy, task force, and ordinance creation, as well as a description of our working group. The second link I'll include will be to our Colorado Springs Fire Code amendments. Turn your attention once you get to that page to Appendix N, which is located at the bottom of the document. Colorado Springs only enabled medical because of Amendment 20 passage, which saw dispensaries opening with business models around it in abundance. Our medical marijuana program and all the related codes and ordinances were all developed out of a position of catch-up. We had to do something with licensing and get on board medically because dispensaries, as I noted, were opening up abundantly throughout the state. Our response then was layered on top of businesses that had popped up over 9 years. So then by the passage of recreational legalization in November 2012, through the statewide ballot initiative, you can imagine the complex work we had to do. Fortunately for Colorado Springs, Amendment 64 afforded each jurisdiction in Colorado an opportunity to opt out of recreational sales, which we did, and quickly thereafter in 2013, placed a ban in city retail marijuana establishments, In 2015, we created a task force made up of public safety, government, caregiver, industry representatives, and really representatives from various areas of our community. And I cannot emphasize public safety's involvement in this task force enough. We created ordinances basically to maintain a certain quality of life for our community. To start, and most significantly, the task force passed a 6-month moratorium on new medical marijuana facilities. This gave the city a time to catch up regulatory rise and work with stakeholders to assess what was developing as a result of now full legalization across the state. Between 2015 and 2016, the task force began to review, study, develop, evaluate laws and regulations pertaining to marijuana businesses, including but not limited to location, licensing criteria, fees, advertising, times and places and manners, and the number of regulations that we would have. The City Council adopted a number of ordinances from the task force, which have been the cornerstone to our regulation of marijuana, ranging from, and as you all have spoken of a bit, amending land use types and classification standards relating to planning, development, and building codes to address personal cultivation of marijuana and medical marijuana facilities, medical marijuana centers, and medical marijuana licensing code. Such things as spacing requirements between dispensaries was imposed, which was pushed by businesses that were a part of our task force. They were worried about oversaturation of the market, and we both were worried about not creating a situation where the city had dispensaries on every single corner. For grows and extraction sites, we don't have spacing requirements. And the location of these grows is not public information, as we don't want these facilities to be targeted. As we put rules on top of existing businesses, you can imagine our issues began to morph. So our advice in hindsight, if we were starting up front, look at what the industry is doing already. What are they thinking about? What are they talking about? Have a game plan to start. Dispensaries with business models will pop up. However, in our case, we couldn't have put our game plan in place before legalization because we would have been picking winners and losers and subject to lawsuit. And I'm speaking of the recreational legalization. By that time, the horse had left the barn, so to speak. Pre-2000 readiness would have been key for us. We then had to manage public perception, as with how dispensaries were operating in real time and simultaneously. This includes home grows and consumption clubs, which at the time, and somewhat still today, broadly represent for a large set of our population what's evil and wrong with marijuana in general. The good news is this helped us lead to regulation for caps on the number of licenses and the separation and spacing requirements, all done in partnership with the dispensaries and caregivers. Everyone came forward and said there were too many licenses here. We differed on how many caps there should be, but effective May 2017, we instituted a cumulative cap of 212 on licensed medical marijuana locations. We know, and began to learn this over time, some small towns have recreational facilities, but they're segregated in certain portions of their town. Dispensaries may be next to one another, but segregated from the rest of the town. So that may be something you would want to consider. Our strong recommendation, stakeholder representation in groups. Put together a working group of good cross-section of representatives so they can figure out what you want. Public participation enables a better perception of regulating the industry in your community over time. You don't have to go through the process again and again with this stakeholder buy-in. When we make amendments, even if it doesn't apply to a larger issue, we're opening things up again and again to get relitigated. Recommendations on what works. We have a dual licensing structure, one for home grows and another for dispensaries. The state is involved. I don't know if I really heard this, if Minnesota is considering that, or will Minnesota allow home grows? Home grows have become a considerable public safety issue for us. Although we implemented a limit to 6 plants per person per household, which totals to about 12, houses under the guise of home grows were and are literally becoming marijuana farms. When medical was passed in 2000, no one did anything about it because it was based on a caregiver model. Rules came in place as rec was legalized. When rec came in, people had constitutional right to possess and transfer products without remuneration with the passage of Amendment 20. That became a business model. We've had to contend with that all along. So it's important to develop clear and concise definitions on what will be allowed and not allowed. From a planning perspective, Colorado Springs now has regulations for single family or 2-family households uses. And I can't say this enough, be mindful of the home grows. We allow for home grows within 1 or 2 households, not apartments. And this led to changes in our fire code, specifically to handle home butane extraction. We then had to define extraction and how it applies to industries, intense commercial areas with fire codes. Chemicals used to do extraction must be defined, water versus CO2, and how that can impact how it's zoned and what's permitted in particular areas. You want heavy chemical isolated to heavy industrial zones. Even though marijuana is legal in the state, we do still have issues with large busts within single family households. We don't allow for outdoor grows like Pueblo. We require 100% indoor. Even though we don't allow for it, doesn't make the issue go away. This is the largest strain on our public safety. Marijuana impacts everyone, even those who don't use it at all. Intentional building codes didn't address marijuana. They don't address marijuana. So for us, wherever there are applications for a grow, we require proper ventilation, I think, which was addressed a little bit earlier. But they have to figure out, the businesses, how to mitigate smell on their property. It's difficult to maintain the smell on a property. We have had issues with that come up time and time again. So you need to be considering, wherever you're implementing regulations for recreational and medical, the way regional building code addresses this. Whatever HVAC requirements must be separate in your system. So I won't go into marijuana businesses. Some of our applicants engineer their system so that they meet the standard requirements. It's approved, but they have to do a lot of work to contain the smell. You may want to write an additional requirement that isn't captured in your building code. We want to emphasize you need definition and guardrails. An example, dispensaries for a while here were gifting marijuana to people, and they would pay maybe $50 for a pipe, and that was the way around a recreational ban. So remember, we banned retail sales, recreational sales, so they found a loophole. It's easy with an industry to do this because they're creative, so they can keep up and find the loopholes. Every issue created for us an avalanche of other loopholes which we had to contend with, the exploitive opportunities. So you all need to be cognizant of potential religious uses as well, because we've had instances of religious institutions saying, parishioners can partake in a sacrament and they will have amounts available for sale or donation for their sacraments. I have more to share if there are any questions related to specifics around public safety, particularly because a lot of our monies and efforts are spent around the area of public safety. Thank you for your time.
Commissioner Ulrich, I think we'll turn it over to you now for Q&A. I do know that Denise, I think, had a hard stop here coming up, so maybe questions to Manitou Springs right off the bat might be well, but we'll turn it over to you to facilitate Q&A.
Hello, I'm Bob Coughlin. I'm going to help with the Q&A at this time. And there's a couple ways we can do it. We have our audience here in person, and then we also have on the Zoom. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions over there. So on the Zoom side, if we can work this out, try to raise your hand so that we know who to call on, and or add some additional questions within the chat, and we'll try to go around and maybe take turns, one from the audience and one from Zoom, and we're going to do a little bit of that. And in respect to Denise, who may have to leave here soon, I'm going to ask, does anybody have some specific questions that we want to start off for Manitou Springs? So we're looking for a question specifically for Denise at Manitou Springs, because we understand she may have to leave soon. So we're going to start with one of those. So okay, we're going to start with a question over here. And
good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Superintendent Teresa Battle. This is a question for both Leslie and Denise. So did you have representatives or the superintendents from Colorado Springs or Manitou as part? So Dr. Michael Thomas from Colorado Springs, and if so, did they look at the impact for early childhood for students at an early age? Was that a factor at all in your vetting process?
Courtney or Denise, do you want to respond to that?
Oh, I thought she said Leslie and Denise. So was the question directed to me?
yes, and I think the question revolved around the inclusion of educators in some of this decision making and how it affects children in early childhood.
Thank you for the clarification. Yes, ma'am. There were educators a part of the task force, and there are also educators that make up the work group that I now facilitate on a quarterly basis. It really played into what we define as our quality of life, which was, reason Colorado Springs opted out of recreational sales in tandem with the tremendous DoD presence that we have in Colorado Springs. We needed to support the federal government's creation of safety and legalities here. Unlike Manitou Springs, we have a bigger population. We have about 500,000 people. So our task force needed to consist of representatives of DoD, education, and such. So yes, to answer your question.
Thank you. And I've just been told that Denise has left the conversation for other obligations. So
gotcha. Okay,
we're gonna
thank
move
you.
on to the next question. So thank you very much. And I'd like to see if we can get a question maybe from our virtual audience from Zoom. So Tracy, if there's somebody who's raised their hand.
Not at this point.
I see a not at this point. Or are there any questions in the chat?
No.
All right, so I saw some other hands here. Over here first, I noticed next. Kim.
Well, unfortunately, my question was for Denise. I was going to ask about the local taxation and how that worked for them. So I don't know that, because we don't do city taxes per se.
Kim, can
as
you talk
sales
into the
taxes.
microphone for the people on Zoom? Can you talk into the microphone?
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to ask Denise how their local sales tax on recreational marijuana worked, because we don't do local sales tax. here, and I was just curious about how they work that and what, the cost was to the municipality to administer that.
Thank you. Let's open that question up to anybody want to take a stab at that for an answer on?
Well, Bob, we do have the local sales tax, and that's one of the reasons, if you remember in our presentation, that we opt to make a decision prior to it expiring, because the state administers that on behalf of the local governments, and it does require businesses to report it. And so, yeah, it's usually administered by the state and then paid back to the local units of government.
We have a tax as well. We tax on medical medical marijuana. And as Ms. Leslie explained, it's paid back to the localities. And we've seen a tremendous influx of tax as a result of medical use and consumption. But we haven't made that our primary driver, and many places focus on the benefits of the tax money in terms of the retail and medical component. It creates a strange relationship once an economy and government structure are reliant on recreational dollars as opposed to just medical dollars. As Denise mentioned, they only have 2 dispensaries, and they're a small jurisdiction, and they don't have grows. And so they need to go get their product from Denver. And so there is not an appetite in Manitou for Colorado Springs to legalize recreational marijuana. Or retail marijuana. So you can see kind of the strange bedfellows that develop once you become reliant on these tax funds.
Thank you. I saw another question over here.
Thank you. Courtney, part of our presentation was on the employee and employer issues. And I think it was pointed out that Minnesota hasn't really contemplated marijuana use within our employee population, and it will create some obstacles, waves, issues. I was wondering if you were able to talk to that experience with Colorado Springs. I know that you've only been there for a short time, but did you experience the same discrepancies in state law versus or application of state law in the employee sector?
What I can speak on is how the city itself, the city government itself, dealt with marijuana usage and employment. And what they did is they looked at usage among sworn civilian personnel and professional positions. And so the civilian personnel are required to take background checks, to perform background checks, which include questions about most recent marijuana usage. They're also required to take marijuana tests. And as someone had pointed out earlier, it doesn't pinpoint when your last usage was. But and for the other portion of city employment, they're not required necessarily to take these background checks or to take the medical tests to assess usage. I can definitely follow up with how the city of Colorado Springs employers have folded in legalization with their hiring practices. I know it has varied quite considerably between DoD, private sector, and other government-like organizations.
I'd like to follow up on that. I worked for a construction company that was multi-state, and as a company, they made a choice that even though their employees could be within a state that had legalization or a state that was out of legalization, their OSHA requirements for safety, heavy machinery, working cranes, dangerous equipment, they still held in place a drug-free policy even when they were in locations that allowed it. So from an employer's point of view, they can go above and beyond the local requirements and still decline drug use within their organization. Question.
Hi, Courtney, and thank you very much for your presentation. It was very thorough. I'm wondering how you go about taxing medicinal marijuana.
Oh, okay. Well, the city of Colorado Springs has a number of taxes, and so they implemented it just like those. What I want to be able to do, because I don't know the details, is to follow up with Tracy on the steps that we took and make that information available to you, if that'll be fair.
Thank you. It looks like we may have a question on Zoom. Tracy?
Yeah, a question from Lil Pinheiro. What have, excuse me, what have been the safeguards put in place by local government to impact the negative results of recreational marijuana use?
Well, for the city of Colorado Springs, remember, and for the state of Colorado, the usage of marijuana is a constitutional right. So we've had to tread very carefully with this, but I don't know if many of you are familiar with a 2021 bill that passed related to marijuana concentrates. So we've been finding, and the research has been showing us that folks under the age of 21 are gaining access to marijuana concentrates. And this has become a tremendous issue for our schools and educators to deal with. And it's resulting in, I guess they call it overconsumption, because with medical marijuana concentrates, folks, it's not flour, which we've all learned about. These are extracted versions of the THC, highly potent. And so it can result in increased psychosis if there have been issues of mental health issues among developing minds already, and it's leading to increased suicides. So with the passage of this bill just recently, the education community, medical community have come together to develop standard language, educational materials to inform parents and youth about the usage of concentrates, as well as the bill defined the changes of packaging to share that how much is considered a serving. We've also worked closely with the medical community, and so we've changed many of the ways in which they allow for the provision of what are they called, the licensing, the medical licenses that are given to medical users. A lot of work has been done in this space because of the increased suicide rate and overconsumption among the youth. So I would highly encourage, and I can include a link to that bill as well.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Bob, Representative Hansen, could you speak to the proposed bill and local control and how that plays out in the proposed legislation?
I absolutely can. Good morning, everybody. And I'm sorry that I was not here earlier, but you know, it's always a great day to wake up and talk about something I am always passionate about. So excited to be back, and thank you for being here. Our current bill around local control is defined in a way that addresses some of the concerns we've seen in other states where local governments were really left scrambling after legalization passed. We see that happening, and that's honestly the last thing we want to do to our local governments here, because we have an opportunity to learn. like Courtney said, there's a lot of things to take into consideration ahead of time. So I will drop a link to the bill in the chat and also to the bill summary, which I think can be helpful documents, but I'll just quick go over kind of what our bill summary looks like when it comes to local control. The big piece is that kind of the synopsis, if you will, is our goal is to avoid prohibition light by having some cities with legalization and some cities entirely prohibiting it. As we talked about at our last meeting, we've just simply found out of our research in other states that has led to some significant public safety issues and some other issues as well. So while there will not be, we're not on a path right now to allow for prohibition in a city, we are on the bill language very clearly says that there is reasonable control, right? Locations, if you're saying not within 1,000 feet of a school. Courtney mentioned having them in the same side of town. These are some of the things that we do want to make sure local governments are empowered to have the control over. Also, we want to make sure that there's an equity in where people can access cannabis. We don't know all of your cannabis consumers in each of your cities, but if you're driving that business out of town, you know, are you potentially driving away a property tax payer or something like that? So just knowing what does your community want, I think is really important. But again, the bigger goal is to work together. The bigger goal is to have reasonable restrictions in similar ways that that we've talked about in the past. So I'll kind of leave it there, but I'll leave it open to other questions too. One thing I did want to mention about local control was about home growing and some of the extraction dangers. We have in our bill that extraction is not to be done in homes. We have seen what that's done in other areas, and so we're really not looking to do that. Like we heard that loud and clear, and that will be a licensed layer of our licensing structure for people to do that extraction in places where there will be specific codes and there will be some other things that we build. So.
Well, thank you.
Great
And
to hear.
well, we have a question here from
Courtney, question. I understand that possession of 4 grams or less of cocaine, heroin, meth, and I think ecstasy, I'm not sure if that 4th one is now a misdemeanor in Colorado. Is that a trend that you've seen in other states? And was that part of a movement, an ongoing movement? And how did that happen in Colorado? And should we be worried about that?
Well, it's something that your legislator should be mindful of. There is a trend throughout the country regarding reducing penalties around possession of marijuana and other substances. And so this is something for us that developed on the state level and has been slowly expanding to include other substances. The city of Colorado Springs takes a position that, you know, we are not in support of reducing penalties for possession of hard substances. And we work together with our legislators to consider the community ramifications of those. But there is a will now to acknowledge the over-policing, as they've described it, within certain communities around substance use and substance abuse. And so it's been a way to treat the usage more as a sickness and not to criminalize. In Colorado Springs, we have worked in partnership with our legal community and our DAs. You know, they are still prosecuting as they see fit, usually around the issues, not so much of possession, but more so with, as the representative pointed out, home extractions, the issues of safety in communities regarding combustion and breaking the rules around the number of plant counts allowed. I hope that helps a bit to answer your question.
Thank you. And I guess I have a comment or question also myself here, is that even though we're looking at two different models on local control, allowing or not allowing the sale of recreational here in Colorado, we understand that they both have to have a similar response in their reaction on not just whether or not they're going to sell in their city, but how they're going to respond to all the issues that Courtney has mentioned, that it goes far beyond just selling. It's how do we respond to this as a community? And we have a question over here. Oh, let me get the mic to you here so everybody can hear. Thank you.
The government is kind of confusing us all as far as I'm concerned, because they're offering loans to farmers for the production of this, and then they're trying to limit the size of these farms. And I don't know how limiting the size changes anything about the individuals that are going to be using this. And number two is government-controlled marijuana is much safer than the stuff they get on the streets. Number one, the stuff on the streets is laced. It's laced with PCPs. It's laced with every drug in the world, or drugs that will actually kill you. And I am not talking from lack of experience with this stuff. I am talking from experience years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Any other questions on the floor here? We have one over here. Thank you.
I guess my question may not be for Courtney, but how do all of these laws apply to sovereign nations? And Bill might be the best person to answer that question. I don't know.
Anybody want to tackle that question? Oh.
Well, I know we have the county attorney. I think he's the best one to talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for throwing me under the bus. Yeah, the laws will apply statewide, whether a sovereign nation or not, just like here with the SMSC. We do have criminal law jurisdiction, not civil law jurisdiction over the reservation. So the laws will apply equally regardless of sovereign nation status or not. Like up in the Red Lake Reservation, and again, it's the state law is the state law. They might have some exemptions for their religious ceremonies and that type of thing, but that's it. Those exemptions are already in place, and those won't change. So the law will apply statewide, whatever the law may be, and they will be subject to the same rules and regulations that the rest of us are.
Thank you. And it looks like we have another question from our virtual audience.
Right. The question is, oops, somebody just chatted it on top of it. It is my understanding that the black market hasn't really left Colorado due to legalization, that it's more of a gray market. And is that something that you're seeing, Courtney?
Absolutely. In talks with our public safety team, this is a tremendous issue. And a large part of it stemmed from the creation of these home grows. And so what our folks contend with is the traffickers move in, rent properties, and turn those properties that they rent, houses in great communities, into farms. And so they do very destructive things, not necessarily to the knowledge of the homeowners. And so they bring in forced labor, and this creates, the feed into the illicit black gray market. And that's going to be the case within any community. We try to address it from not enabling retail within our city limits, but it evolved partially because we weren't as fast to put in place our regulations and enforcement. But also in part, you're going to have the illicit market developed just out of not wanting to adhere to laws. I mean, we see it in tobacco, we see it even in alcohol. And so our fire and our police would say these home busts and the breaking up of these illicit teams, the laborers, is a big part of what they do. And so that's an important consideration when a area thinks about going legalization route, whether it be medical or recreational. The tax money is great, but you'll be using a considerable amount of that tax money on public safety to deal with this. And it's important to also consider what's happening on the federal level, because as things become more decriminalized, as it moves from a Schedule 1, the market will change in a big way. And so we're keeping our eye on that. We have a lot of areas across the state, like in Aurora and Denver, that have disbanded their enforcement teams. They're not going to even prosecute because of the changes that they see coming and the reduction in misdemeanor offenses.
Thank you very much. We're starting to approach the end of our time here, and I want to give maybe a little opportunity for maybe some final thoughts. Courtney, I want to thank you very much. You've been very helpful and informative. We really appreciate you taking your time to be with us here today. Leslie, do you or any of our panelists have any final comments or responses to any of the concerns that we've discussed? Any other additional input? I'm going to turn it over to you for that, some final thoughts.
I would open it up if any of the panelists, Representative Hanson, Lisa, Cindy, Brad, anything you've heard that you want to add?
This is Cindy. I just want to add one comment, and that is, in the state of Minnesota and the legislation that's being put forth, there is no ability to tax locally. So the state excise tax goes to the state. In the bill, you cannot, as a community, determine that you do not want to participate. It is not allowed. So
Understood.
it's like all for one and one for all. There is no local money coming in. The property tax revenue that's coming in would come in just based upon property tax laws. That would be part of the tax base that we would use when we look at our levies. So as the impact to law enforcement and public safety increases to try to oversee this, even though in the legislation, it is not their responsibility. It is the responsibility of the state to prosecute and enforce. The consideration would be, I don't know where they're going to get the people to do this. If they're going to hire all these people who are going to be camped out in all these counties and the cities to help prosecute, to be able to go in there and do a lot of oversight, they don't really talk about that. So I just want to make sure that this group on this call understands there is no local revenue, there is no local decisions on not allowing it within your community. And the question to the state would be, and I know Representative Hanson is off, is how are they going to be able to manage and do the oversight and prosecution necessary in order to alleviate the demand on local government?
Thank you for sharing that, Cindy. That's much different than what the city of Colorado Springs and the state of Colorado contends with. I wanted to share that I know that this issue is complex, and myself, I'll just reiterate it, myself and our public safety team would be happy to make ourselves available for additional presentations and discussions through this area. So Tracy has my contact information, and I would be willing to come out and talk virtually at any time.
Great. Well, I'm sure we'll take you up on that. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you to all our panelists and all the people that have worked on this. It's been a great presentation, and we're very happy for what we've experienced and heard and can discuss here this morning, and how well everybody's done in getting this issue before us. we're going to wrap up right now. Is there any, this is open forum. Is there anything going on in your city or township or community that you want to announce, make us aware of it? This is kind of your time. Anybody? We'll see. Oh, is there anybody online that has anything they want to say or? Okay, well,
Can I,
Go-
can I just say one thing?
yes.
There was a few links that were put into the chat in Zoom, and so the people on Zoom can access those, but the people in the room really can't. So I think I'll ask Lisa to send out that information. The
Oh.
things, it was from the people from Colorado as well as from Representative Hanson.
Okay, so links and so forth, future information, look for that in our scale mail coming out. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a happy holiday, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And thanks for coming.
Take care.
Thanks, Courtney.